uplifting and very desirable to read. I encourage you to read Lamentations 3. It's a very uplifting book, chapter. It even has some songs that come out of it that are very uplifting and glorious. Yes?
I think it needs to be pointed out here too. The temple being the centermost point of all of Judaism. Now this is before the time of synagogues.
Yes, they did not have synagogues. They didn't go to church in the sense that we talk.
3 times a year they were to come to Jerusalem.
Okay, 3 times.
But the fact is that the temple has fallen in such repair, it does not seem like it was even being used because they had discovered these scrolls.
Well, there are several mentions of it being used, but they were being used for like stables for sacred horses and quarters for male shrine prostitutes and altars to these weird gods and things. I mean, there's several mentions of them setting up these altars in the temple and having these quarters for the male shrine prostitutes and having the horses stabled, these sacred horses stabled in the area. And so they were using it, but certainly not for the application it was intended at all, I don't think. And so no, they didn't seem to be doing that. I mean, they had knowledge to some extent, but it was probably so tainted by historical, passing down information that they probably really didn't know what was going on. Now, the finding of the book, the implication is that during the repairs, they found it. And so that kind of suggests that it was sort of tucked back in a corner somewhere and people had forgotten it was back there. I mean, have you ever done that with anything in your own home? I have. I go, where did that come from? It's just in a corner in the den somewhere up against the backside of a bookcase or something. And I go, God, I didn't even remember I had that. That's been gone for, I don't even remember having that. And then it shows up, So this apparently is what happens here. So they go to find out what all this means with regard to the national lifespan to the prophet, I guess it's pronounced Huldah, Hulda. It says, who is the wife of Shallum, son of Tikvah, and then he does another, the son of Harhas, I guess that's how you pronounce it, keeper of the wardrobe. So these were people who were in the court, at least the grandfather was in the court, and he kept the king's wardrobe, presumably. And so his granddaughter-in-law is a prophetess, which is relatively rare for any time. Can you think of some female prophets in the time of Christ? Hannah. Oh, Anna, the prophet, who speaks about Christ himself in the temple. There are more female prophets in the New Testament. 4 of them. Refers to Philip's 4 daughters who prophesied. Now, it doesn't really matter how you define prophesying. This was not common. But Philip had 4. I believe it says they were unmarried daughters. I can't remember for sure. I didn't look it up. But he had 4 daughters. Philip, one of the apostles, had 4 daughters who prophesied. And whether they are speaking prophetic utterances on behalf of God or whether they are inspired preachers is immaterial. They were prophetesses and accepted by the church as such. If that kind of thing or something even remotely similar to it were to occur today, we would be all appalled and objecting to it, I guess, because of our historical practices. But we need to be aware that sometimes God, goes, watch this. I'll show you what's going on. We have some women in this congregation who de facto, not officially, but de facto have served in the function of elders, but not officially. Some of these women have been regular consultants to our elders. And we need to be aware of talent wherever it is. And if God has given whoever a great talent of wisdom or knowledge or understanding or any other characteristic that is useful to His kingdom, we need to accept it and go on, and not be so wrapped up in trying to define what's correct procedure. In this time, women were way worse off than anything you can imagine in our society. As I've mentioned to you in the past, they were the closest thing I can describe the average woman in society to her husband, perhaps, would be in the range of a really beloved pet. I mean, that sounds horrible, but it's actually closer to reality than what we do today with our relationships with our wives. They could divorce their wives for any reason at all, and the wife had no recourse under certain circumstances. They could even kill them if they wanted to. They had virtually no public rights to speak of. But yet here is this woman, and also Deborah the judge and some others who came forward and distinguished themselves. What am I doing? Holy cow, that got out of the... I almost stabbed myself on my toothpick. I got this steel toothpick that's a dental pick, and it crawled out of its plastic container somehow, and I was wondering what in the world that was. So anyway, here's this prophet Huldah, and she tells them that he's going to bring disaster eventually on the kingdom of Judah. He's already done so on Israel. They're gone already into Assyria. And he says they've been just like the folks up in Israel. I'm going to destroy them anyway. But it says down in verse 18, tell the king of Judah who sent you to inquire of Jehovah, this is what Jehovah, the God of Israel, says concerning the words you heard. In other words, he heard the law being read. Because your heart was responsive and you humbled yourself before Jehovah when you heard what I have spoken against this place and its people, that they would become a curse and be laid waste. And because you tore your robes and wept in my presence, I also have heard you, declares Jehovah. Therefore I will gather you to your ancestors, and you will be buried in peace. Your eyes will not see all the disaster I'm going to bring on this place. So they took her answer back to the king. That sounds, very sad. That even though he has turned, God knows what's going to happen with these next few kings down through here. It's hidden behind the acrobat reader thing there. But after Josiah, we have more bad kings, and the people follow them. And so God says, I'm going to destroy it. I'm going to wipe it out. And we do know that eventually the king of Babylon comes in and takes them away. So in chapter 23, it's kind of interesting. Josiah doesn't go, well, what's the use? I'll just give up. He doesn't do that. It says, the king called together all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. He went up to the temple of Jehovah with the people of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests and the prophets. There were a lot of the prophets. All the people from least to the greatest. He, the king, read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant which had been found in the temple of Jehovah. The king stood by the pillar, which was supposed to be the official king's addressing place, and renewed the covenant in the presence of Jehovah to follow Jehovah and keep his commands, statutes, and decrees with all his heart, all his soul, thus confirming the words of the covenant written in this book. Then all the people pledged themselves to the covenant. So they decide to remove all of the nasty things from the temple. He instructs them to take the articles made for Baal and Asherah and all the starry hosts, and he burns them outside Jerusalem in the fields in the Kidron Valley, and he takes the ashes to Bethel, which is north of Jerusalem, I believe. He did away with the idolatrous priest, meaning he killed them, appointed by the kings of Judah to burn incense in the high places. And all around he burned those who burned incense to Baal, to the sun and moon, to the constellations, and all the starry hosts. We had heard this going on under Manasseh and many of the other kings. He takes the Asherah pole, which was in the temple of Jehovah, to the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem and burns it. He grinds it to powder and scatters the dust over the graves of the common people. Tears down the quarters of the male shrine prostitutes that were in the temple, there's that again, and the quarters where women did weaving for Asherah. Apparently they sacrificed all kinds of clothing or sold it as blessed clothing or something. He brings the priest from the thrones of Judah and desecrated the high places, which were the idolatrous worshiping sites, from Geba to Beersheba, where the priest had burned incense. He broke down the gateway at the entrance to the gate of Joshua, which apparently was also used for some idolatrous purpose. Although the priests of the high places did not serve at the altar of the Lord in Jerusalem, they ate unleavened bread with their fellow priests, which is kind of strange. It's funny, they held on to that process, but they didn't hold on to anything else. This is called following procedure. Well, we have to do the unleavened bread, but we can be bad people. But we're required to do the unleavened bread. See, that doesn't make any sense. He desecrated Topheth, I guess is how that's pronounced, or Topheth, which was in the valley of Ben Hinnom. So no one could use it to sacrifice their son or daughter in the fire of Molech, which you've heard mentioned before. He removes from the entrance of the temple of Jehovah the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun. So these were sacred horses dedicated to the sun, being housed in the temple. They were in the court near the room of an official named Nathan Melik, which means gift of Malik. Malik was, I don't know what that was. Do you know what that means, Bill? Okay. I know what Nathan means. Josiah then burned the chariots that were apparently in that same place that were related to the horses, dedicated to the sun. He pulls down the altars the kings of Judah had erected. Remember, even the good kings of Judah would go around doing all this good stuff, but they wouldn't tear down the high places, or they would leave some of the altars in place, and he gets all of them. He said they had erected some of the altars on the roof near the upper room of Ahaz. So these were associated with the temple too. And the altars Manasseh had built in the two courts of the temple of Jehovah. Again, they're using the temple, but not for its original plan. They removed them from there, smashed them to pieces, and threw the rubble in the Kidron Valley. He also desecrated the high places where the seat that were east of Jerusalem on the south of the hill of corruption, the ones Solomon, this is like 500 years ago, the ones that Solomon, king of Israel, had built for Ashtoreth, the vile goddess of the Sidonians. You don't hear much about her except on occasion. Sometimes it's easy to confuse Ashtoreth with Ashtorah or Asherah poles. They're two different things. And also Chemosh, the vile god of Moab, and from Molech, that was the guy that they sacrificed children to, and for Molech, the detestable god of the people of Ammon. In other words, he cleans house. He smashes the sacred stones and cuts down the Asherah poles and covers the site with human bones. Now, you might say, well, what in the world is, if he scatters it over a cemetery or if he covers the site with human bones, what is going on there? Human remains were considered unclean by the Jews. So if you put bones or human remains or something on a site, it became an unclean site. And even in these idolatrous times, they felt that way about things. So he's desecrating these sites or making them unclean for the use of anything. We would talk about salting the earth, which of course makes it difficult to farm. And so he's putting these bones out here, and he's taking some of these sacred idolatrous things and destroying them and then scattering them in a cemetery, which doesn't desecrate the cemetery, but desecrates the stuff he put in the cemetery. When we were in Europe, I think it was last year, they're starting to run together on me now. We were in some little town, and as you're walking down the street, you look up and you see built into the sides of the houses the occasional Jewish tombstone. You knew it was Jewish because it's written in Hebrew on it. And the guide explains, this was in Germany by the way, the guide explained that these tombstones were taken by German people who were not Jews, and built into their buildings to, in effect, thumb their nose at Jews. And we went by some Jewish cemeteries, and they are interesting because Jews apparently do not maintain their cemeteries. They're grown over, headstones are falling down and everything, and they are very much against the whole idea of moving a cemetery or building something on a cemetery, which we actually have laws associated with that now. I believe it's 100 years after the last person dies, you can go in without, other than just a city permit, and completely empty the cemetery, move the remains somewhere else, and build a building on top of it if you want to, 100 years after the last person is buried there. I believe that's the number. And we kind of maintain our cemeteries more like gardens, and we keep the tombstones and everything up. The Jews, they didn't go to the cemeteries that much. They pretty much just let it go. Yes?
They had a habit of when they would go and visit a grave, they would leave a stone.
Yeah, okay. They would go, but it was just not one of the, they didn't treat it the same way we do. But taking a gravestone from a Jewish cemetery was very irritating to them. Well, it would be irritating to us too, I guess, but even more so to them, because that was the monument to the person that had lived, and it was also an unclean place in general because of the bones and things that were there. So anyway, he cleans the slate, and in the process of doing all this, in verse 17, they run across and they see a tombstone, and it turns out that it says it's the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and pronounced against the altar of Bethel the very things you have done to it. I don't know if this is Elisha or some other prophet we don't know anything about. We are told Elisha was buried. Of course, Elijah was never found. He apparently went straight to heaven. Anyway, the king says, don't disturb it. They leave him alone. And it says, and then so they spared his bones and those of the prophet. So now we got two prophets that we're not sure about. The prophet who had come from Samaria. So probably one of those is Elisha. Don't know for sure. Anyway, he takes care of all this cleaning house. He even goes up into Samaria, which is outside of his kingdom. If you look in verse 19, goes up into the towns of Samaria and cleans house up there too. But of course, they're already gone to Assyria, and so he could go up there without a problem. So in verse 21, he says, let's celebrate the Passover according to the way it's written in the book. This had not been done in a long time. There had been Passovers, but it had gotten so corrupted and messed up till they probably didn't even know what they were doing anymore. And Hezekiah had also held a Passover, but he had done so without benefit of the book. So he was doing the best he could, but he probably wasn't doing it exactly correctly according to the instructions in the book. So he says, let's have the Passover according to the way it's said in the book. Verse 22 says, neither in the days of the judges, which goes back a long way, as much as 1,000 years, who led Israel, well, actually a full 1,000 years if you go all the way back to the beginning, who led Israel, nor in the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah had any such Passover been observed. That doesn't mean they didn't observe the Passover, it just wasn't this great. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, that would have made him 26 years old or so, this Passover was celebrated to Jehovah in Jerusalem. Now, it doesn't go into detail about the Passover here. And in general, Chronicles doesn't give a lot of additional information. You remember 2nd Chronicles is basically 1st and 2nd Kings, essentially, the historical period. And for the most part, Kings and Chronicles, and 1st and 2nd Kings and 2nd Chronicles tend to just parallel each other, almost word for word in many cases. And there'll be a little bit here and there that one will say or add. But 2nd Chronicles chapter 35, if I can get to it. I'm in 34 here. All right, don't fight me. 2nd Chronicles 35 says, Josiah celebrated the Passover to Jehovah in Jerusalem, and the Passover lamb, this is additional information. It just says he had the Passover and it was a great Passover, and that's about all it says in 2 Kings. It's like 2 verses. This entire chapter is devoted to that Passover. He holds the Passover. The Passover lamb was slaughtered on the 14th day of the first month, which is the correct day. He appointed the priests to their duties and encouraged them in the service of the Lord's temple. That's an interesting phrase. He encouraged them in the service. He said to the Levites, from whom the priests come, but not all priests are supposed to be Levites, but not all Levites are priests. He said to the Levites who instructed all Israel and who had been consecrated to Jehovah, put the sacred ark in the temple that Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, built. So, we knew this is true, but he confirms that the temple that they are dealing with is the one that Solomon had built back in roughly 1000 BC, and we're in the late 500s BC now. So it had been there for many hundreds of years. This is the temple that has the 2 great big cherubim standing wing to wing in the Holy of Holies with the Ark of the Covenant right at the base of them. Very glorious temple, possibly the most glorious of all of the buildings of the temple. And he says to take the sacred ark in the temple that Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, built. All right, it says put the sacred ark in the temple. Apparently they had removed it and it was somewhere else. This is one of the few times that the ark is mentioned during this whole 500-year period. Remember, David dances when they bring the ark back from the Philistines because they're stricken with all kinds of illnesses and everything. Some people say it was basically hemorrhoids that they were stricken with and other diseases. But they send the ark back. They can't stand it. And David's just dancing all over the place, and it comes back into the tabernacle, not the temple. And then Solomon builds the temple, and they put the Ark of the Covenant in the temple. They see it again. When do they see it again? Do you recall? They see it one time, and the only thing that's in it is the Aaron's rod that budded, I believe, is the only thing left in the ark.
Historically, when the Jews settled
In their conquest, there was a semi-permanent place set up at Bethel.
Okay, and he has been up in Bethel.
This is where the tabernacle was left, and all the items that were in the tabernacle would have stayed there.
Stayed there. So they're bringing this back into the temple then. And it doesn't say, but presumably the only thing that is in the ark is the Aaron's rod that budded. There were 3 things in the ark. What were they? Aaron's rod that budded was in there. The what? A pot of manna, which theoretically never rotted. And the 2 tables of stone with the commandments on them. And the stone tablets and the manna were gone. And I forget when that happened. That may have happened during the Philistine occupation. You know, they would have opened it and looked. And contrary to Indiana Jones, you don't die when you open that necessarily, unless you perhaps are a Jew. But they opened it, they looked inside, and they went, oh, look, 2 stones. And they probably pulled those out. And they went, what's this pot of? What is this stuff? By the way, that's what manna means. What is it? And
we also have to remember that those 2 tablets of stone were not like 2 tombstones that we normally see.
yeah, they were probably just square-ish, if anything.
Probably and possibly the size of your notebook.
Yeah, they might not have been that big. They could have easily been this size. Of course, you'd have to chisel it pretty tightly, but that one was done by Moses, right?
The first one was done by Moses.
Because the first one was done by God, and the second set was done by Moses. So God could have done it in any font he wanted to, but Moses had to work pretty hard to get it done. But yeah, the tombstone shape is probably not real. And they're probably not that high, because it would have been very difficult to carry 2 rocks that big in your arm and climb out of a mountain.
Consider the size of the Ark of the Covenant was about the size of our communion table, and it was overlaid in gold. Which is
maybe, let's see, how many cubits was it?
I don't remember.
I think, was it only 1 cubit wide? It was slightly smaller than that table.
About that size.
Yeah, about that size, roughly. Anyway, they moved the Ark of the Covenant back into the temple. By the way, this is the last mention of the Ark of the Covenant in the entire Bible as far as where it is. It disappears. And the presumption is that it was carried away when the king of Babylon came here in about, 30 or 40 years, I suppose, something like that. When he comes in and takes the people away, the assumption is that he carried it away, because it mentions that he carries away all the sacred objects and everything. And people say, well, it doesn't mention the ark. Okay, fine. So either he took it or they hid it, one or the other. And if they hid it, why didn't they hide all the other sacred objects? It's an obvious question, isn't it? If what'd you say, hon?
I said there is I don't know what you would call it. I'm thinking that the Ethiopians had.
Yeah, I was thinking about that myself. The Coptic Christians in Ethiopia, who traced their history back to the Ethiopian eunuch that was baptized by, I always get this wrong, I even gave a sermon on it one time and said it wrong. Is it Philip? Okay. I forget who I said, but I preached an entire sermon one time using the wrong person's name for that. Somebody said, you know it was Philip, don't you? Oh, shoot, didn't think about that. But anyway, they trace their history back to him, and they claim to have, I forget what the name of the city is, but there's this little city that has this small temple-looking place, and they claim the ark is there. And every year they bring out what they say is a copy of the ark and parade it through the streets, and it's a very famous area, but nobody gets to see it.
Descended from Solomon and the Queen of Sheba.
Yes, there's a lot of I don't know if you want to, I don't want to insult them and call it legend. We will call it unconfirmed history is what we'll call it. That they have a huge connection to the Jews that goes way, way back there. But, and of course, this whole ark has caused all kinds of movies and books and things to be issued. Does Revelation mention the ark? I want to say it does. I can't remember. I'll have to look that up for next week or something. But anyway, so they have this great Passover, and they go through just a long litany of stuff that they do. And essentially, it's just this giant party for a week. They eat just thousands of animals and just all kind of have parties and musicians and just really having a great time. And we will take up next week with the death of Josiah and follow it from there. I am drawing a blank this morning on a blessing. So I will just say, God bless you.